Hey guys, so this is the last lecture for this unit before your test. And though it's one of the shorter PowerPoints, it is one of my particular interests, and food security cannot be talked about without addressing biodiversity. Uh, so with that, I'm going to share my screen here. So before we get started, I want you to think about a question. All right, which of the following is a reason to conserve biodiversity as you know it? All right, we'll go through this PowerPoint and on biodiversity and see what we learn. So what is biodiversity? Maybe you asked that question, answered that question, not really knowing fully what it was, but it's not too uncommon. Bio refers to life and living things, then diversity of living things, right? So the variability among and within the species living in some given area. If you look at anybody's front yard, especially if they have people, a landscape provider, it's not very diverse, is it? It's pretty monoculture green grass. It might be whether it's fescue or rye, it's going to be. Now, then there's that neighbor, of course, who has the undesirable lawn, which might be a healthier lawn, and it's got some weird mixture of grasses and a few wildflowers and weeds. That would be much more diverse, right? So you can see that biodiversity is an aesthetic. It's an aesthetic. Whoops. We still there? That may be very well important for our psychological, emotional, social health. Besides that, it's also very important for what it provides to us, the value of ecosystem, goods and services provided by it, from wood to food and shelter and fuel, ranks in the trillions of dollars a year. So species richness, how many different species you have is the total number of species. Relative abundance is the number of those individuals of each species present. All right. So the theory and the idea here is more diversity means more heterogeneity, more different genes. It's a gene bank. Nature and wild ecosystems provide a gene bank from which we can make withdrawals in timely manner. So communities include numerous species without a single or without a few dominating species. That would be a heterogeneous environment. If there's only a few different kinds, like I said, front or backyard, possibly, that would not be very heterogeneous, and therefore there'd be a lack of diversity. So there are about 12 million species on Earth, not counting bacteria and viruses. We're finding more of the time about 10,000 new species are named each year. So all in all, we consider 12 million species on Earth, and we've described about 1.7 million of them. That's about 15%. Still plenty of room to learn, to grow, to explore. We haven't yet. So where is all this biodiversity? Clearly, we are pretty much gray. This has been very, now we have some beautiful areas, but when you're talking in reference to places like Madagascar, South America, even the Far East or East Asia, comparatively speaking, these areas that are heavily populated are not quite as biodiverse. Okay, so as many as 44% of all species of vascular plants, and plants are the base of a food chain, of course, in the ecosystem, those in the microbes. So 44% of all species of vascular plants, 35% of all species in 4 vertebrate groups are confined to 25 hotspots. That comprises only 1.4% of the land surface of the Earth. It's pretty crazy to think about. So the biodiversity of crop wild relatives. So in light of a food security focus, when you think about, there's probably about 30 foods and crops, give or take, that we eat from. And of those, 50% comes from about 4, right? Maize, wheat, and rice. Those 3 alone make about 50% of most people's diet. Where would we get, new, if we're trying to increase production, yields, nutrient availability, location for it to grow, if new pathogens or other abiotic factors come into and begin to affect these crops, like the potato blight did, like we had with corn in the 1960s, wipe out these crops. Well, there's nowhere to go except the wild. And so you go back to what's called these centers of origin, where the crops first originated, to find new genes possibly that could be used to help our current crops. Well, anyway, here what we're looking at is the wild relative taxon richness map. So if you're looking at it right here in this Mediterranean area, the red, pretty clear, this dark red indicates a greater overlap of the potential distributions of taxa. That is where greater numbers of crop wild relative taxa occur. Taxa is just a particular kind of specific species in the same geographic area. So you have a lot of diversity right here in the Mediterranean area. You have Iran, Iraq. You have, let's see, this is the Red Sea. This is Mediterranean, I believe. Yeah. So a lot here. You have as it spreads across southern Europe and northern Africa. The land and the plot has changed, which we already know that from the previous lectures, as we've talked about, and desertification and such. So this is very different than what it used to look like. Truly, this red used to spread all the way down through here. You can see in India, Nepal, Pacific East, Southeast, and some parts of North America, we still have some amount of richness. So all is not lost, though. Plant biodiversity and the Anthropocene, which is where we are now in the broad timeline of history. So as we've been stating, so percent native levels. So if it's a dark green, just in here, and over the rest of the globe mostly, we don't have very much, anywhere from less than 1 up towards to 15, maybe 20% native level species, meaning almost all native have at some point in history gone extinct. And it's probably providing a lot of the fossil fuel that we have now, buried. But once again, you look over here, you see in Northern Africa, you see, again, right near the Middle East, or in the Middle East, and over here, Northern India down into Nepal, and pocket to China, we still have over 50% native level. 50, well, we'll just say 45 to 50%. So that's very good, but that land is being lost quickly. And if you look down here in South America, you got the same sort of thing going on. All right, so biodiversity loss. What does this affect? How does it happen? Well, one, of course, urbanization. So China, they really promote living in the city. And of course, their culture has to some degree, of course, everyone goes to the city because that's where the universities are. And you have a kind of a social status climb for being able to successfully live in the city. And they leave that so that the outer areas of growth can be used for farmland. There's a few other places in the world that do that. But for the most part, for a large part, and especially Americans, we like to have our space. Right? We like to have our land, we like to have our views, we like to fence in our property, and it gets cut off from others in our privacy. That's not a bad thing. Like I said, aesthetics, it's like that front lawn again. It's a matter of choice. But that urbanization, that urban sprawl, because obviously even if our rate of increase is slowing down, we are still increasing, and that's going to continue forever. So urbanization will infract upon that native habitat. Agriculture, of course. Now, actually, ag is returning a lot of land back to restoration ecology or even other forms of development. Invasive species can take over oftentimes. And we've had, you know that even right here at MSU, down Grant, chop down all the pear, and we put up a native tree that'll be blooming, but it used to be so, well, it will be pretty again, but those will become invasive and they're popping up all over the wooded deciduous forest here. So that's not good. And I know in Texas and along the Gulf Coast, there's a vine that just coats and makes everything look green, but it's the same vine. It's covering out and blocking out the sun from hitting any of those other trees and plants, and the understory is not growing. Without much of an understory, there's not much food for wildlife. And so these invasive species can come in and can really damage the habitat, because these animals that survive on other plant life that are not thriving begin to either move, migrate out of an area because of habitat loss, or maybe even become extinct in worst case or endangered. And then obviously pollution is one of those. We'll talk possibly about, or you might have seen or about the dead zone also in the Gulf of Mexico, and it is just south or just bordering Louisiana, Mississippi, and it's growing. And pollution from runoff, possibly in the Mississippi River, the nitrogen and phosphorus is causing a very large dead zone, such that aquaculture people are spending more money on fuel and gas for their boats to drive out further into the ocean to go fishing for the same. And sometimes you go back to one spot the next year and they're not there. The dead zone has grown. And so the time and man to try to find these places to go fishing and cast a line or a net are getting harder, and that's aquaculture. So farmers have indirectly reduced biodiversity by crop improvement. So once we do find a location to fish, right? Once we do find a crop that grows well, that produces more, we don't want to change it, right? We don't want to risk it. So just as you've learned, through time, we've always kind of bred. So it used to happen naturally. Now we can do it. We can speed that process up through breeding. Well, as we get a better plant, right, then that's the only one. Every time you pick a head of corn, you want that to be just as juicy or sweet as that last one you had. So in this sense, we've reduced biodiversity, of course, by monoculture and just growing all of one kind of food. And that reduces the heterogeneity, but towards the positive end that we're feeding and eating a better food. Transgenic crops and biodiversity, well, generally not significantly different than agriculture in general. There's three concerns with transgenics. You can increase diversity by bringing in genes from other wild plants, as I was referencing earlier. So let's say you do have a crop that is becoming more susceptible to pests, and there are losses. You can bring in these transgenic BT cotton, BT corn, BT potatoes, a lot of BT now. We'll talk about genetic engineering later. But these transgenic crops increase the biodiversity, but there are risks with that involved. So it can be introduced to other wild relatives or even to other insects and pests, which may then evolve to it. Gene flow always occurs. It's always going to, if you're eating or feeding or carrying, you got DNA and RNA on your hands all the time. Center of production is usually not the center of diversity. So where we're growing these large monoculture crops, we might be the most successful at growing corn here in Missouri and Iowa, but this is not where corn originated. Corn originated in Mexico, right? So the center of production might be here in the Midwest, let's just say, but this is not the center of diversity for corn. So we need to be able to go back in there. But we'll go into Mexico, we'll bring and cross a wild strain, try to introgress that wild gene into our new crops. So we need to protect that wild resource at the center of diversity in order to bring it into our crops at some future date should we need to. What can happen is we can read with transgenes or transgenic crops is you get reduced weed populations, which again is good because you get rid of that extra labor and that costly pursuit of weeds stealing or affecting your crop. But you also get reduced insects, reduced bird populations, possibly. Weeds are always controlled in all monocultures. Reduced biodiversity of crop species. The number of available cultivars with transgenes is similar now to the number of cultivars available before transgenic crops. So just a moment for pause to think. And again, I'm not emphasizing a one or the other, just some pros and cons, things to consider. regarding the environment and the natural gene bank and the ecosystem from which we pull this rich diversity. This is the guy, Aldo Leopold. You may have heard of him before if you've been in ag or conservation biology. So why should we protect or promote biodiversity? And he says, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to save all the cogs and wheels. I walk into my dad's garage and I will always see the leftover screws, nuts, bolts, tools, and parts to cars and lawnmowers, because you never know when you're going to need them, right? And if you get rid of them all, and then somebody comes or you come along and you limit your choices for how to adapt or build or put something together. So save all the pieces. Well, we need to do this with breeding as well and with the ecosystem. So what this guy did, he wrote many essays and even kind of, well, he lived out what he believed. So he bought a big plot of land in Wisconsin along the river there. And as he sat in the middle of his property, kind of on a chicken wire, old table surrounded by chicken wire, and surrounded by bare land, tufts of grass, used to be ag field, just nothing growing there. They invited a bunch of friends and neighbors and people who kind of believed and thought the same thing. And he encouraged them to kind of plant whatever they wanted, but it had to be prairie and natural grasses and flowers and things along the Wisconsin River. And he was able to restore that. He was able to restore that entire area. Beautiful. It was gradual, but the ag land and the weed pests that were accumulated there were outcompeted and were put out. So now that was about 1935. He died in 1948, but he opened up this whole new field of ecological restoration and taking care. And we do a lot of this now today, of course, restorative ecology, and that is converting unusable land or overused and abused land into more ecosystem-rich forest. So a species-rich community is more stable. Multiple species fill the same niche, so communities can recover from the disturbances or compensate for the loss of other species. And they're more stable to a point. The system becomes less stable beyond some critical level of diversity. We can see on a graph, and you'd learn that in biology or conservation biology, but right here we're just kind of promoting the richness. There is a carrying capacity each environment can hold. Species diversity is related to ecosystem functioning. More species means more production, more biomass, more chemicals, period. To think about this last point, again, species diversity, ecosystem functioning, there are so many plants, so many Madagascar, the rosy periwinkle, we found in this, the chemicals harnessed from that are used as for childhood leukemia. The Chinese star anise, right? The fruit, the star fruit that we get, is used, basically has shimic acid, and that's the Tamiflu, for the flu. So many of these, plants, vegetables, we call it now ethnobotany, right? Have use. If we lose them to extinction, would no longer, of course, be available. Another good example was Taxol, which is extracted from a Pacific yew tree, the bark of that tree. And now this had been known and had been used to treat all kinds of like ovarian, breast cancer and things. And it was almost used to depletion and extinction, but now we're able to harvest that from the leaves and we can begin to grow that in a monoculture, but it wouldn't have been there had we lost that habitat, right? So species richness and ecosystem functioning, and that's just besides the wood, of course, and the fuel and the things that we can get from it. Everything has value, intrinsic value, or even if it's instrumental value, we can get something from it. But even in of its own, the beauty, the aesthetic, extinction is irreversible. And I'm not trying to raise plants and ants and everything to the level of human rights. I'm not saying that, but we do have a responsibility of stewardship to protect what we have for the use of ourselves and future generations, and even just, again, for the value that each living thing has in and of itself. It does have that right to exist, but not to extinction. Food security now. So increased productivity. What we get in biodiversity, all the plants that are not drought tolerant will die. But the ones that survive must have a mechanism for surviving that drought. Plants or trees that are sensitive to the pest will die off, but there will be some that survive, and those have a mechanism for resistance to that pest. And the same thing for nutrient and water use efficiency. You, maybe not the best analogy, but you might have seen on a plot of land where one tree looks like it's totally died and another tree looks perfectly fine. Why was one tree able to survive, in the same general climate and region and area where another one was not? Clearly one got sick somehow. So that ability to have that resistance can be passed on now by that tree. Nutritional value, all these things are reasons we want to protect biodiversity. Genesis 1:28, all these things in the garden are here for you to eat. There was a plant in New Guinea, I'll have to remember the name of it here, winged bean, relatively recently found in an area where it was very undernourished. And of the winged bean, you can eat the stems, the roots, the leaves, the fruit, the flower, and the legumes. All that can be eaten, and has drastically increased the amount of nutrition available to that. And so loss of this biological diversity kind of undercuts similar future opportunities to find these food sources that are out there for disease, that have chemicals in that can fight leukemia or cancer or pain, Hodgkin's disease, or even add nutrition, as we just said, to the table. All right, so one way we do this, because as we just said, agriculture, right, and monoculture tends to limit that gene or biodiversity. However, and so making a reason for conserving those wild centers of origin. Well, one thing we do is gene banks, a collection of seeds, plants, or animals that are maintained as a repository of genetic material, typically to preserve genetic diversity. So there's more than 17,000 around the world, but there are a few big ones that are backups to those. So a germplasm, a specimen that contains the information for a species' genetic makeup, a valuable natural resource of plant diversity. These are about 500 seeds that are sealed and frozen in time that could be planted. And some of them go way back, talk about heirlooms. So they have accession numbers and they're entries in a gene bank, and they're very, very large libraries, basically. Okay, so a quick pop quiz. Species richness is the number of individuals of each species present. Number of individuals, true or false? In which region will you find the most wild relatives of crops? I just said this one. Don't worry about those. Where would you find the most wild relatives of crops? Centers of origin. Which of the following is not a cause of biodiversity loss? Well, crop improvement gets down to monoculture, clearly. Urbanization, that's sprawl. Pollution, we talked about aquaculture. Transgenic crops does not cause biodiversity loss. That's when we're actually bringing it in and increasing the biodiversity. But nonetheless, it can have some biodiverse loss ramifications with respect to the weeds and the insects and birds and things that feed on them. Okay, so Svalbard, trying to say on Svalbard, Global Seed Vault. Click on this link in the PowerPoint. It's about a 16-minute video, but it's an excellent video. Again, these are professionals, so they're going to be better than mine, talking about the seed vault. So this is one of the major backup seed vaults to many other seed vaults around the world. So we just said there are about 17,000 in different regions holding wild and native seed to that region. And many of them are sent to vaults like this. This is built in the permafrost off of Norway. So if the power goes down, the seeds stay frozen. There's no unfreezing these things. This goes about 130 meters through rock. They had to carve out a bunch of rock in this mountain. It doesn't look very special in there, but it's just amazing to think about the number and the kinds and the genetic diversity of seeds from history, from your grandparents' grandparents' grandparent, that can be in here, that have been collected in seeds. Why did scientists choose to locate the global vault in Svalbard, which is in Norway? It's cold and it stays frozen. Researchers have recently made withdrawals from this seed vault. Is that true or false? Oh, did I say this one? I don't think I said this. Well, the next slides might give you a hint. So, cotton conflict. Here's one of the issues. So in Aleppo, Syria, there's about 141,000 seeds previously accessible to researchers and plant breeders and geneticists. And you can see a nice picture here. And this is what it looks like now after the war. So these other places don't have the capacity to house the whole thing. So in Lebanon, Turbo, they got 30,000. In Rabat, they have 20,000. So you can see that it's not just abiotic factors, but we also have biotic factors that are that influence the diversity of our crop species. So biodiversity of wild relatives, we have about 81 crops in these gene banks. 30% of known wild relatives of crops are not present in these gene banks. So there's still room and need. We don't know what we're losing out on or what we may lose out on in the future without those 30%. Crops with especially limited diversity in the gene banks include sugarcane, sugar beet. This only in southern and tropical areas can we grow sugarcane, but these are important for global food supplies because obviously sugar, right? Sugar beet, maize, banana, plantain, cassava, sorghum, yam, cowpea. All these are pretty significant, pretty important crops. Might be a couple of them there that you haven't heard before. Important for the smallholder income, cacao, papaya. Important for nutritional qualities, quinoa, and other miscellaneous fruits. So a lot of these, when you get native and wild gene banks in order to introgress for future times of need and to increase survivability and nutrition. Livestock biodiversity is not much different. It's equally important for animal agriculture. Of course, they depend on feed and such, but some cattle, livestock of various kinds, hog, are more disease resistant, more productive, or produce with greater efficiency, or are just consumer preference. So 17% of the world's farm animal breeds are at risk of extinction. And these losses are due to indiscriminate crossbreeding, doing so to try to get without the science behind it. You can introgress just as well, not bad genes, but undesirable genes or genes that tend to dampen the effect of stronger genes. The use of non-native breeds, such as Angus. As much as we prefer Angus breed, it is possibly the cost due to consumer demand is costing us a little bit of our biodiversity. Discarding less productive breeds, of course, as well. But in these less productive, and production is big, of course, in plant and in animal breeding, you're always looking for yield and production, high production. But sometimes when you discard a few that may not produce, they may have within their gene bank of that organism resistance genes to, or tolerance genes to drought or freezing or things like that. Let's look at example here of the Pentanero cattle. With less than 1,000 remaining here, because they've just been used and reared without a real breeding program. Well, there is one now to keep them from going extinct in the wild. They're descended from Spanish and Portuguese breeds. So they're able to defend themselves against jaguars. Their hooves tolerate seasonal moisture extremes. They eat submerged grass, resist local diseases and parasites, and they survive well in the hot temperatures as well. So these are some things we might want in our own cattle that we're raising, right? Out on the range. However, the meat may not be the best. It's not a preference yet, or they might have high production, but they do have these other things that are desirable. So conservation efforts are in place here. This is in South America. Brazil is where they're primarily found now. This Gerlando breed here. So here's a Pantanero picture. These are kind of a black and white. So this is probably about 80% of Brazil's milk come from this. This was kind of a mixture of this Pantanero brought into a Holstein, right? So Holstein's a milk producing cattle. And so here you have Gerlando. Not a lot known on this. You could look them up, but there's genes in here that we want to conserve and preserve for future. And with a little more of a breeding to a point that you want to conserve and look for the good, right, genes in these cattle before extinction. As I mentioned, conservation efforts are in place. Okay, I'm going to wrap up right there. I'm kind of going on. Hope this was helpful. Look at those questions. There are also some on the beginning of this PowerPoint that I did not go through. They'll be useful for reviewing for the test coming up this next week. Have a good day.